You whisper alone under fluorescent lights. Your leg bounces beneath the cart, and your nails are already bitten. 1 in 3 people does this, but the reason is the opposite, and one experiment exposed the pattern. Self-control was not the reason. Its answer changes all 4 habits. Let us start with one of the most widespread, repetitive body behaviors on the planet: nail biting. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of the general population does it regularly, and the common assumption has always been that it signals anxiety, stress, a nervous temperament. But a research team at the University of Montreal ran an experiment in 2015 that told a completely different neurological story. They brought habitual nail biters into the lab, sat them in front of screens, and put them through boring tasks, frustrating tasks, stressful ones, and relaxing ones. The researchers filmed the participants' hands the entire time, counting every bite. Then they checked which emotional state produced the most biting. The answer surprised them. The trigger was not stress. It was boredom and frustration. These participants scored significantly higher on perfectionism scales. Their brains were generating more internal demand than the external environment could satisfy, and the body responded with a motor outlet. The circuit responsible lives in a pathway connecting your prefrontal cortex to your basal ganglia. Picture your prefrontal cortex as a demanding supervisor sitting at the top of your brain, sending instructions downward. It sets goals, anticipates outcomes, and generates internal standards for how quickly tasks should be completed. Your basal ganglia sit deeper, nestled at the brain's core, in a region shared with reptiles and birds, and they generate automatic motor patterns. In nail biters, the supervisor is issuing demands faster than reality delivers results. The frustration signal travels downward through the white matter tracts. The basal ganglia respond with a repetitive motor output, a physical pressure valve that releases the tension between internal expectation and external pace. So what looks like nervousness from the outside is actually a mismatch between your brain's performance standards and the speed of the world around you. The nail biting is not the problem. It is the solution your nervous system invented on the spot. But this next mechanism reveals something even more counterintuitive about what your body does when your prefrontal cortex needs fuel. If you have ever bounced your leg under a desk during a meeting, tapped your foot while reading, or shifted your weight continuously in a chair, someone has probably told you to stop. They find it distracting. You might even feel self-conscious about it. But the neuroscience of fidgeting tells a story that should change how you think about movement and cognition entirely. Your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for working memory, sustained attention, and executive control, runs on dopamine and norepinephrine. These catecholamine neurotransmitters keep the executive circuits energized and online. When they drop below a critical threshold, your prefrontal cortex begins to lose its grip on whatever task you are trying to hold in working memory. You have felt this. You are reading something complex. Your focus drifts mid-sentence, and you have to start the paragraph over. That drift is your dopamine supply running low. Fidgeting is your body's countermeasure. Picture the motor strip running along the top of your brain like a keyboard, each key controlling a different body part. When your prefrontal cortex runs low on fuel, the leg key starts pressing itself. That rhythmic motor activity activates the supplementary motor area and sends catecholamine signals back up into the prefrontal cortex. Your body generates movement in order to generate the neurochemistry your brain needs to stay engaged. It is a self-fueling loop built into your motor system. In 2009, researchers at the University of Central Florida did something that sounds almost cruel. They brought participants into the lab, gave them progressively harder working memory tasks, and measured how much they moved. Then they told the movers to sit still and gave them the same tasks again. The results were immediate. During high-demand tasks, physical movement increased proportionally to difficulty, and when they restricted that movement, performance collapsed. The fidgeting was not a distraction from the task. It was a prerequisite for completing it. Think about what that means next time you are in a meeting. The person bouncing their leg is not failing to pay attention. Their motor system is actively pumping catecholamines into the prefrontal cortex to keep it funded. The movement supports cognition rather than competing with it. Your body learned this trick long before anyone taught you what dopamine was. But the next behavior on this list recruits an entirely different system, one that most people associate with communication rather than computation. Talking to yourself out loud. If you have ever muttered directions while parallel parking, rehearsed a difficult conversation before it happened, or narrated your own cooking steps while standing at the stove, you have engaged in what researchers call private speech. Society treats this as slightly odd. Neuroscience treats it as one of the most powerful cognitive tools your brain has access to. When you speak out loud to yourself, something specific happens inside your skull. The same region that produces speech directed at other people, Broca's area in the left inferior frontal gyrus, fires at full power. You simultaneously recruit your comprehension center and your executive sequencing hardware. Your brain processes self-directed speech with the same complete neural architecture it uses for real conversation, directed inward rather than outward. Imagine a surgeon talking themselves through a complex procedure, step by step, or a chess player muttering candidate moves before committing. They are not performing for an audience. They are running their full language production system as a cognitive tool. Watch any 4-year-old assembling a puzzle, and you will hear a running commentary. The child narrates each step out loud because speaking the plan makes it easier to follow. Pick up the blue piece, turn it around. Try the corner. They are not performing for an audience. They are using spoken language as a cognitive tool, holding the plan in place by saying it aloud. As children mature, this external narration becomes internalized as inner speech, the voice in your head that narrates plans and evaluates options. But when cognitive demands spike beyond a certain threshold, adults externalize again. They start speaking aloud because the brain needs more processing bandwidth than silent thought alone can provide. The mechanism involves a component of working memory called the phonological loop. Think of it like adding a second monitor to a computer running out of screen space. When you speak words aloud, you create an auditory trace that persists briefly in echoic memory. This trace feeds back through your language comprehension areas and reinforces whatever goal you are trying to maintain. The information does not disappear between steps because the auditory channel is holding it active. A comprehensive review in Psychological Bulletin in 2015 confirmed this across dozens of experimental paradigms. Self-talk enhances self-regulation, improves task switching, and supports complex sequential problem solving. The person muttering to themselves while navigating a parking lot is not losing coherence. They are using their language hardware as external scaffolding, offloading cognitive work into sound so the prefrontal cortex can allocate its limited capacity to the hardest parts of the problem. But several of these mechanisms share a common architectural principle, and understanding it changes how you interpret all of them simultaneously. Before we reach that unifying principle, there is one more body behavior worth examining because it carries one of the most persistent myths in popular anatomy: cracking your knuckles. You have almost certainly been told, perhaps hundreds of times across your lifetime, that this causes arthritis. Your parents said it, your teacher said it, but the actual biomechanics tell a different story. The sound comes from a process called tribonucleation. Your finger joints are encased in a capsule filled with synovial fluid containing dissolved nitrogen and carbon dioxide. When you pull the joint surfaces apart past their resting range, the pressure inside the capsule drops rapidly. The dissolved gas forms a cavity, a bubble, that collapses almost instantly. That collapse produces the characteristic pop, not bone grinding against bone, but a gas physics event occurring inside a fluid-filled biological capsule. In 2015, researchers slid a volunteer's hand into a real-time MRI scanner and watched the process happen live. They saw the bubble form and collapse in the joint space, confirming the mechanism directly on camera. And as for arthritis, A physician named Donald Unger spent 60 years cracking the wood, knuckles on only his left hand, while leaving his right hand untouched as a control. Every morning for 6 decades, same routine, same hand. Then he examined both. Neither showed any arthritis. He won an Ig Nobel Prize for the dedication. Larger studies have since confirmed across broader populations that habitual knuckle cracking does not increase the risk of osteoarthritis. The guilt people carry about this habit is based on a myth with no biomechanical support. The behavior persists because proprioceptive sensors in the joint capsule register the sudden pressure change and the brief increase in range of motion that follows. Your nervous system interprets this as sensory resolution, a small tension loop opened and closed within a single gesture. It is the same reason stretching feels satisfying after sitting too long. Your body craves the sensory confirmation that a joint can move freely through its full range. And that concept of closing loops connects directly to the unifying principle behind every behavior we have discussed. Every habit on this list shares a single architectural principle operating beneath it. Your brain runs a continuous optimization algorithm aimed at keeping cortical arousal within a narrow target band, balance between stimulation and idleness, between overwhelm and boredom. Neuroscientists call this homeostatic regulation of cortical arousal, but the functional version is simpler. Your brain has a thermostat, and these repetitive behaviors are the mechanisms it uses to adjust the temperature when the environment pushes it outside the target range. Nail biting engages when your executive cortex is generating demands faster than reality delivers results, dissipating frustration energy that has nowhere productive to go. When your dopamine supply falls short of the cognitive load, leg bouncing generates the catecholamines your executive circuits need to stay online. Self-talk recruits auditory processing as an auxiliary system when the problem exceeds the bandwidth of silent working memory alone. And knuckle cracking provides proprioceptive resolution when your joint sensors register tension that your conscious mind has not yet noticed. But here is the part that changes how you interpret all of this going forward. The basal ganglia sit at the center of all 4 mechanisms. This ancient brain structure predates the evolution of the cortex by hundreds of millions of years. And it has no concept of social norms or whether your colleague finds your foot tapping annoying. It monitors exactly one variable, keeping the prefrontal cortex within its optimal operating window. When that window is threatened, the basal ganglia generate whatever motor pattern restores equilibrium fastest. What that means is that every habit on this list is evidence of a functional homeostatic system doing its job. The motor programs exist because they solved real survival problems across deep evolutionary time, keeping attention sharp, keeping frustration manageable, keeping cognitive resources available when they mattered most. But this raises a question worth addressing directly. If these behaviors serve legitimate neurological functions, when do they cross from adaptive into something else? Every behavior we have discussed operates on a spectrum. At one end is the person who bounces their leg during a long meeting and performs better because of it. At the other end is a college student who bites her nails until the nail beds bleed and then hides her hands in her sleeves during class. The first person's basal ganglia are doing their job. The second person's system has been captured by a feedback loop where the behavior itself now generates more distress than it resolves. The circuits and neurotransmitters are identical at both ends of that spectrum. What changes is the gain, the volume on the system. When that volume exceeds the point where the behavior causes more harm than it resolves, professional evaluation becomes appropriate. So the practical insight is not that you should suppress these habits. Suppression, without addressing the underlying neural need, simply redirects the motor energy elsewhere. The person who stops biting their nails through willpower alone often starts picking at their cuticles instead. The person who forces themselves to sit perfectly still in a meeting spends the entire hour fighting their own motor system rather than listening to the presentation. Understanding why each habit exists gives you a different path. You can address the boredom directly, build movement into your workflow, or use speech aloud when a problem overwhelms your silent working memory. These behaviors are your nervous system reporting what it needs to maintain optimal function. The difference between people who struggle with their habits and people who leverage them often comes down to whether you read the behavior as a character flaw or as biological feedback. Your brain has been refining these regulatory mechanisms across 400 million years of vertebrate evolution. The next time you catch yourself bouncing your leg in a meeting, remember what is actually happening beneath the surface. Your basal ganglia are running the same program they have been running since before your ancestors had a cortex at all, keeping you sharp when the world is not doing it for you.